Hello, everybody. This is Kavita Singh. I teach art history at JNU, and I'll be giving a talk on Rana Safvi's page. First of all, I want to thank Rana very much for asking me to do this. Rana, I really admire the many things you do, and it's a privilege for me to be asked to climb onto this very active and exciting platform that you've built. For all of you who are listening, I'd like to give a word's background. A few days ago, I was asked by a very vital and interesting page run by DU students, Karma, the Heritage Journey, to give a talk on understanding Mughal portraiture. And subsequent to that talk, I was asked by Rana Safvi to focus on one aspect that I had just touched on in that talk, which is the depiction of women in Mughal painting. So I have to thank Rana for asking me to do this, but I also have to apologize to anyone who has heard that talk because you will find some things repetitive. There are some overlaps between the previous talk and this one, but I assure you there are a lot of differences as well. Making the visible invisible, portrayal of women in Mughal painting. The eloquent title of this talk was given to me by Rana. And my only contribution to it is the question mark. Why did I put in a question mark? Many scholars who have worked on the lives of Mughal women and the way in which the harem functioned have already questioned for us the extent to which women were indeed invisible in Mughal life. And we know they exerted a lot of power, they influenced the politics, they made a number of decisions, and they also had a great deal of financial independence. As an art historian, however, I would like to question not so much whether or not women were visible, which I think a lot of feminist art historians have given us a qualified reply to, but as an art historian, I would like to question the extent to which the paintings actually do the work of making women visible. Even the paintings that portray women, are they making invisible forces or invisible characters visible to us at all? It's been an interesting time for us art historians as we've watched a larger and larger number of scholars taking an interest in Mughal painting and seeing how they can use it as a source. And this is really wonderful because the way in which we look at paintings is constantly being enriched by all the perspectives that are coming from people who are studying social history or the history of music or the history of medicine, for instance. It's been wonderful to receive their inputs and see things through the lens that they carry with them. But as much as paintings reflect cultural history, that is, as much as they reflect the relations, the social structures that produce them, they are also embedded in a history of image making. And sometimes it isn't just social contexts that produce paintings, but it is paintings that produce paintings. An earlier painting or an earlier way of depicting something begets a subsequent and a successive way of making paintings. Just imagine the situation when a young painter is getting trained in the Kitab Khana. He'll be trained with a senior artist. He'll be told how to make some things by the artist, or he will be given training by being told to imitate the masterworks that have gone before. As he learns to paint, he inherits a whole training in how to draw a figure, how to pick his colors, how to populate a composition, and all of these actually form a framework for how he approaches his task. And even as he innovates, as he must, as he goes on in his life, he will innovate from something that has been inculcated in him. He won't be innovating from a void where he has absolute choice and freedom. So just as we would understand that a literary tradition would produce certain norms and certain protocols in text to follow. So if you are going to write a ghazal, and if you are Faiz Ahmed Faiz and you want to write a ghazal which is political in nature, you can do that. But you would still be following certain forms of the ghazal in order to even make your innovation show within the tradition of ghazal writing. So just as poets and literateurs follow certain literary protocols within which they remain confined even as they innovate. Similarly, there are lineages of painting which actually lay out templates for the artist to follow. And so today, when I invite you to look with me at Mughal paintings that depict female figures, I'm inviting you to look at these not just as paintings being like a window that will give us a thrilling glimpse into Mughal history or society as it was, but also as a window into Mughal painting and the norms that it follows. So to look not just at the relationship between the painting and what it depicts, but to look at paintings and the relationship with the models and ideas for what a painting like this should be. So, a painting of a wedding, for instance, will give us information about weddings in Mughal times, but they will also give us information about what was the norm to follow, what were the cliches, if you like, that you had to be included in every painting that depicted a wedding. Let me begin today by showing a Padshah painting that I showed in that earlier lecture that some of you might have heard. And this is a Padshah painting that shows a wedding scene. It's showing Shah Jahan in the ceremony of the Sehra Bandi at the wedding of Dara Shikoh, his favorite son. And on the high terrace of the palace in Agra, we are seeing Shah Jahan seated under a canopy, and he is gifting Dara a Sehra that is made of precious pearls. Below at the ground level, there is music and dancing, which is part of the celebration. But when we look at the dancers closely, we see that what seemed at first to be an extremely animated crowd, in which we're seeing all sorts of different people involved in the celebrations, turns out to be rather differently handled by the artist when he's depicting the men and when he's depicting the women. When we look at the men who are standing at the right, we see that they are highly individualized. Each face is different from the other. The expressions on the faces are different from each other. But when we look at the female figures, the ones that had seemed so different from each other in the beginning, had seemed so very diverse, actually turn out to be pretty much the same figure and the same face, which is repeated just using different angles for the hands, sometimes the faces, and also the coloring of the skin. So the artist is showing us men who probably are portraits of real men who were serving at Shah Jahan's court. But for the women, he is putting in the place of each individual dancer a trope or a type of a beauty of that time. Now, it is as though the artist wants to show us women and doesn't want to show us women at the same time. And so instead of showing us real women, he is showing us the idea of an ideal woman, and he is therefore drawing a veil over the faces of the women who actually danced. Now, the default assumption of us, contemporary viewers who look at these paintings and notice this anonymity of the women who are shown in it, is that it must be because of the rules of Parda that the artist was never able to see any of the women at the Mughal court, and therefore he only had to rely on his imagination in order to depict these women. But this would not have been true for all women. It would not have been true for the women that we're seeing in this painting, because these women were not in Parda. They are women who are public women. It is their job to be seen and to be visible to a large audience. And therefore, even when the artist could observe real life women, when the norm seems to be to develop just a type for a young beauty and to plug in that generalized image wherever a woman has to be portrayed, whether or not it was a woman whose face the artist would have seen. Now, the quality that we're seeing in this Shah Jahani painting is reached at a relatively late stage of Mughal art. But even in the early days, when the kinds of skills that we're seeing here of portraiture in the way the men are being depicted had not been achieved, even in an earlier phase when the Akbarnama was being made for Akbar, we see a similar approach. We see the Akbari artists striving for exactly this same effect. So in this painting from the Akbarnama that is made at least 40 years before the Padshah painting, we see a celebration of another wedding. And here again, there are dancers and musicians. And again, when we look at the details, we see that even at this relatively early stage of Mughal painting, the men are differentiated much more by the artist than the women are. The skills in portraiture are not great. The artist really isn't able to make lifelike people. So the men also don't look like convincing individuals whom you would recognize on the street, but you still see that the artist is making an effort to make one face round, one face slim. But the women all look very, very similar to each other. And in fact, the women all have squarish heads. You see how the tops of their heads are almost flat. They have very large breasts and hips. They have tiny pinched waists. And they all wear transparent ornis. And as unlikely as it first seems, this female figure that we're seeing in the Akbari painting is actually based on the way earlier traditions that were present in India before the Mughals depicted female figures. Art historians usually call this style the Chaura Panchashika style, which is named after a very famous manuscript in this idiom. And it has a very, very stylized, but a relatively lively formula for the depiction of female figures with square heads, transparent ornis, large hips, large breasts, and tiny waists. So when the Mughal atelier was expanded under Akbar, dozens of artists who were working in this Chaura Panchashika tradition were hired. And as they trained under the Persian masters, their visual language was upgraded into something that would fit in with the very refined Persianate tradition, but some echoes of their old visual language remained in Mughal painting, particularly in the depiction of women. And I think even though in Akbar's time we see the paintings are more soft, more naturalized, you can still see some underlying presence of the Chaura Panchashika style in the way the heads are conceived, the bodies are painted, and the default costumes are made for these women. And even in this fantastic painting from that famous manuscript of Akbar's time, the Hamzanama, which shows this fearless female character, Hosh Kiram, beheading a spy. On the left-hand side, there's the whole painting. On the right-hand side, there's just a detail of this female figure. Even in a painting like this, you can get a sense of the Chaura Panchashika style figure, which is lying underneath the portrayal of Hosh Kiram. And the reason for this preference, I think, becomes clear when we recall that these artists who came from these Desi Indian Chaura Panchashika type traditions, when they were training with the Persian masters in the workshop, the masters whom Humayun had brought from Persia, and if we look at the kind of painting that they had brought with them, we look at what that very sophisticated, very beautiful, very elaborately decorated painting of the Persian masters could look like. And we see that the overall compositions were very elegant and complex, but the human figures that they made all had these round moon faces, which are considered a mark of beauty, and perched on these long and slender bodies that are totally cloaked in garments. In fact, uncharitably, some scholars have called this the lollipop on a stick look. And really, if it wasn't for the fact that the male figures have beards or that their headdresses are different from the women, you wouldn't really even be able to tell which figure is male and which figure is female. And therefore, I think it's small wonder that when Mughal painting develops its vocabulary, it sees that these Indic traditions hold a key to depicting female figures that are more robust, more vivid, more obviously female, and they choose to follow that pattern or norm rather than the Persianate one. Over time, the style of Mughal painting changes and it becomes increasingly sophisticated and subtle. But one thing remains constant, that when women are depicted, they are depicted to a formula. The formula can change, but there is a formula for Mughal women. You see this, for example, in Jahangir's time, which period a certain type emerges for female figures, which has moved away from the Chaura Panchashika look. It has a much more naturalistic look. The faces are very gently shaded, the angles are not harsh, the colors are sophisticated and subtle. But the fact remains that women, when they are depicted to a formula. All the women are slim, they are young, they have long black plaits, they have heavy eyebrows, they have doe eyes, rosebud mouths in these beautiful oval faces with pointed chins. Here's a famous painting of Jahangir during the Holi celebrations in his private apartments. And in the background of the whole painting on the left, you're seeing Jahangir, who has drunk so much that he has to be supported by these two women. And he's sort of stumbling his way to the bed that's been laid out for him. And in the foreground, there are all of these women who are making merry, and we see a detail of them on the right-hand side. And when you look at all these musicians and singers and revelers, you see that pretty much, again, the same face is repeated across all of the women. So the Mughal artist understands that it's part of his code. When you make women, you don't make women, you make beauties, and the beauties conform to a certain ideal type. This application of this kind of formula is repeated across paintings from the time of Jahangir and Shah Jahan. So you can have oddities like an album in which there are individual portraits of living women from the royal family. And though the paintings are presented to us as though they were portraits of real living historical figures, like Jahanara, for instance, or Nadira Banu, the sister and the wife of Dara Shikoh, for whom these paintings were made, even for these supposedly real living individual women who are being honored with a portrait, the figures also conform to that same type of the ideal lovely woman. And the same thing also happens across a range of betrothal portraits that are meant to celebrate the engagement or the wedding of a prince, where he is shown sharing a special moment with his beloved or his betrothed. And it's very hard in paintings like these to tell the princess apart from the maids. Here is one betrothal portrait of Jahangir's son Parvez with his wife. She's depicted as a beautiful woman, but the three maids who are attending them are equally beautiful and of very similar facial types. And then here is this painting from Shah Jahan's time where Dara Shikoh is shown with his wife. And again, if you look at the detail on the right-hand side, you'd be very hard-pressed to tell the difference between the faces of the bride who is sitting with her husband and the maid who is waving the fly whisk over them. It's like a formula has been developed for the beautiful woman, and this is repeated again and again. And there is a very insightful article by a scholar called Molly Aitken. The article is called Pertinent Portrayal, and she identifies this kind of stylization as a method that the artist works out of showing the woman without exposing her. So the stylization itself functions as a kind of a discrete veil which is drawn across the living woman's face. Not only that, but in many such paintings, we would say from today's perspective that they rob the woman of her selfhood, that they objectify the woman, they turn her into a thing. But Molly finds that many of these paintings were actually patronized by women, and they gave them to their husbands as gifts, as something for the men when they went away on battle or on journeys, for them to remember their wives by. So within this tradition of image making, it seems as though the agency actually even lies with the woman, where she is fine with being remembered, not by her individual features, but as a type or a trope of lovely perfection. Now, this insistence of Mughal painting on this stylization of the image of the woman sometimes can lead us into very ironic situations. For instance, if we look at this painting from the Akbarnama, which tells us about an event from Akbar's early childhood, something very interesting is happening here. Now, when Akbar was born, Humayun was in dire straits. So when he was about a year old, his parents left him in the care of an uncle, and they went to Persia to look for help. They returned 4 years later. And Akbar, who had not seen his mother since he was a 1-year-old infant, at the age of 5, he was presented to this group of women, not told who his mother was, and Humayun was just watching to see what Akbar would do. And Akbar unerringly went up to his mother in a group and immediately singled her out and sat on her lap. So this was hailed as a sign that Akbar was an extraordinary child. No, if he didn't have some kind of great intuition, at least he had perceptions or a visual memory that was exceptionally sharp. But when we look at this picture, which is all about making visual distinctions between different women, between one, recognizing one individual woman and singling her out from the rest, again, all the women are practically identical with each other in the way the artist depicts them. So this seemed like a particularly ironic instance of the stylization still being adhered to by the artist, even at a moment when he desperately needed to individualize the female figures. In the Akbarnama and the Jahangirnama, which are great illustrated manuscripts, which were made to record the reigns of Akbar and Jahangir, we find paintings that mark what was probably the most significant occasion in the life of a queen, which was when she gave birth to a son and heir. And in the previous talk, I'd already discussed this very famous painting of the birth of Jahangir, which seems at last to give us a glimpse at the faces of real women from the royal family. But we have to stop short in that supposition when we realize that this painting is being made by an artist about 50 years after the event, and these very believable portraits of what must have been Jahangir's mother, what must have been Jahangir's grandmother, are all fanciful creations of likely portrayals invented by the artist's fertile mind. Many years before Jahangir's artist made this scene, the birth of Jahangir, when he was called the Prince Salim, had already been recorded in the Akbarnama. Here we have birth scenes from two of Akbar's sons from the Akbarnama. On the left, we are seeing the depiction of the birth of Salim. And on the right, we are seeing the depiction of Akbar's next son, Murad. Would these paintings be any more credible as depictions of an actual historical event because they were made closer to the time that the births actually took place? There are differences in the details in these two paintings, but in both of them there seems to be a similar approach in some broad outlines. For example, in the uppermost part of the painting, there is a chamber. And in the chamber, which is hung with all of these curtains and has these qanats around it, in that chamber, there is a mother who has just given birth. In the left-hand side, the mother is still lying in bed. On the right-hand side, the mother is sitting in the bedchamber. But there is a whole flurry of nurses and probably midwives who are tending to them. And there are various other kinds of bustling scenes around them, preparations for the baby's first bath, celebrations, the giving of gifts, and so on. As we move closer to the scene of Murad's birth, you see all these little details. There is an angiti, there's a silbatta, there's an aftaba, and it all suggests a scene that is very closely observed from daily life. I'm sure a lot of these details, particularly of the objects that we're seeing people using, are taken from daily life. But the composition as a whole actually takes a cue from some European prints that had been coming into the Mughal court through travelers and missionaries. And these are images, not of the birth of Christ, because though those images came in large number, that would not have been an appropriate model for a birth scene of a prince, because after all, Christ was born in a stable and he was put in a manger. But there are a lot of illustrations that enter the Mughal atelier, which show another birth, which is the birth of Christ's mother, the birth of the Virgin Mary, who is born to Saint Anne. And this birth provides an appropriate reference for the birth of a special person. Now, when we look at European art and we look at its depictions of the birth of the Virgin, across time and across different styles, we see that it follows a formula of the mother of the Virgin lying in bed, which is draped with elaborate curtains. The baby is in the arms of a nursemaid, and there are busy preparations afoot to take care of the mother and the child. And when you compare this formula with what is depicted in the Akbarnama scene, you see that the artist has translated this European formula into a local Mughal 16th century context. But some basic ideas about the composition definitely are sparked off by the virgin scenes. And the artist takes it from there and he improvises with his own localization and a plethora of details. The likelihood that this biblical scene provided some framework for the scene of Mughal princes being born can be gauged from paintings like this one on the right, which is a Mughal drawing, which is made after the European engraving on the left. The popularity of this theme of the birth of the Virgin can actually be gauged by the fact there are in existence today multiple versions of this theme which are attempted by Mughal artists. So after this very beautiful drawing on the right-hand side, which was made sometime around 1600, I'd like to show you this other version, which is not as sophisticated, but is also unmistakably a version of the same scene and made about 120 or 125 years later. So these are just two examples. There are several other examples beside which show us that this biblical theme was not only well known, but it exerted a powerful pull on the imagination of the Mughal artists. The missionaries who brought these paintings and prints to the Mughal court were very flattered by the kind of attention that they garnered. And we are told that Akbar and his sons and all the high-ranking courtiers all seemed fascinated by these images, and they also treated them with a lot of respect. The missionaries thought that the paintings that they were bringing or the prints and the engravings that they were bringing would attract the Mughals towards Christianity. But instead, the fascination was actually with the image rather than with the religious context that had created them. We hear in historical sources that Akbar ordered his artists to copy the paintings and the prints that came pouring into the Mughal capital from Europe. And the enthusiasm of these artists to probe this new visual language becomes very obvious when we see how skillfully and with what care they respond to all of these incoming images. For example, the prints themselves must have been considered very precious collectible things because we see that a number of them are pasted into the albums and are very lovingly surrounded with appropriately chosen verses of calligraphy and these beautifully illumined borders. But Mughal artists also made versions of these prints. And among one of the most popular themes for them to make versions of were images of the Virgin Mary with Jesus as a little baby in her arms. And I'm going to show you just a smattering of the dozens of images of the Virgin Mary and child that Mughal artists made. In this slide, we are looking on the right-hand side at the Dürer original print, which must have traveled to Mughal India. And on the left, there are two different versions by Mughal artists of this theme. And here in this slide, we are seeing three variations on the theme, obviously based on other sources that have come in, which show the same motif of the Virgin Mary with the child. And more examples. And more. So you can see that there was a plethora of such images coming in, and there was a tremendous response on the part of the artists who were looking at these and making their own versions of them. Now in this image, we're seeing a famous painting in which Jahangir is holding a picture of the Virgin Mary, and he seems to be looking very attentively at it. And some scholars suggest that we should see this as a companion or an analog to another well-known image of Jahangir in which he's holding a portrait of his father. This is after his father has passed on. So he's holding an image of his deceased father. And if we consider these two paintings together, we could say that in one, Jahangir is holding a painting of his actual father, and in the other, he is holding a painting of his spiritual mother. So in that case, replacing a portrait of his real mother with a portrait of this ideal, archetypal mother could once again be another instance of the artist discreetly drawing a veil over the real woman who was the mother of Jahangir, while suggesting that she also was somebody who possessed tremendous virtues. But the idea of Mary seems to have taken very special hold over Akbar and Jahangir, and Shah Jahan as well. When the Jesuit priests saw the interest that the Mughal emperors were taking in the images of Mary, they thought that the emperors are just on the verge of converting to Christianity. But this was an error on the part of the Jesuits because, for one thing, Mary is already a revered figure within Islam. So, paying respects to her is not a turning away from the faith. But there is another very special reason for the Mughals to invoke Mary as the symbol of an archetypal mother. The Mughals were very proud to trace their lineage back to Genghis Khan. But 10 generations before Genghis Khan, there was a mythical ancestress called Alankua who had 5 sons who were the founders of the 5 main Mughal clans. 3 of Alankua's 5 sons were born after her husband died, but she refuted any charge of infidelity by saying that these sons were born because a mysterious ray of light had entered an opening in her tent, and a mysterious being, also made of light, had come riding on this shaft of light and had entered her. And therefore, she had born these children as a consequence, and these children were Nairun, they were the children of light. Now, Alankua's story has an obvious analogy to Mary's virgin birth. And Akbar's biographer seizes on this story, and he says that that divine radiance that had come into Alankua's womb had passed through all the generations that had followed between Alankua and Akbar, but this divine radiance was sometimes dim, it was sometimes eclipsed, but in some cases it shines forth brightly, and never has it been more radiant than in the person of Akbar himself. Now, not only was the memory of Alankua kept alive through Abul Fazl's texts, and I'm sure through a lot of discourse, but in Akbar's time, all the significant mothers of the Mughal line were recast as Marys, also as people of impeccable chastity, who presumably were giving birth to children in the Mughal lineage, but who also were passing on to their children in their wombs this beautiful heritage of light. And therefore, all the mothers of this lineage get recast as Marys of their time. Akbar renamed his own mother, whose name we know, Hamida Banu, as Maryam Makani, or the Mary of the palace. And his wife, Harkabai, who gave birth to Salim, the crown prince, she was referred to as Maryam uz Zamani, or the Maryam of this age. And we see this image of Mary being invoked in many, many situations across Mughal art. So it's not just Jahangir holding a small picture of Mary in a private moment of meditation, but you even see in this very busy painting of Jahangir's Darbar, where he is receiving his son Parvez, when he is looking down favorably on his son, as he looks down on his son, so does the Virgin Mary. I hope you can see the detail on the right-hand side. I've circled the image of Mary, painted here as though she was a fresco present in the palace, but also participating in the scene by standing in for the mother. Now, the Padshahnama, which is the book which is made to illustrate the history of Jahangir's successor Shah Jahan's life, also has a number of invocations of the Virgin Mary, which are tucked into these scenes as though it was just a mural on the palace walls. And it's interesting that these are scenes where Shah Jahan's artists are recounting the early successes of Shah Jahan, where he's just won a big military victory, where he's come and reported to his father, and his father is saying, wow, you did something great. Here is a fantastic jewel as a mark of my happiness and excitement. And there, just as the father and son have this important exchange, again, you can see in the detail on the right, which again I've circled with red, you can see that the mother again seems to be looking down, beaming down on this scene as though she's taking pleasure in his success. And so also in this other moment, also from the Padshahnama, where yet again, Shah Jahan, who is still called Prince Khurram at this time, has just returned after another big victory to his court, and his father is again congratulating him and embracing him. Again, you see, in this case, both Jesus and Mary taking pleasure in his success. Now, if Mary is the mother, then the Mughal emperors are no less than Jesus, as you can imagine. And the Catholic imagery which the Jesuits bring to the Mughals with such hope of converting them and attracting them to Christianity, actually becomes something that the Mughal emperor sees on, and they get their artists to recast and reformulate it to make all the appurtenances that had been applied to Christian saints, to Christian prophets, and they get applied to the Mughal emperors themselves. So the symbol of the halo, the symbol of the orb, and such other signs of spiritual, divine greatness become applied to the Mughal emperors themselves. There's actually an interesting paper by Asfar Moin, which explains that this imagery of Mary and Christ allows the Mughal emperors to assert their status as quasi-divine beings and as quasi-divine rulers through a route that is different from the route taken by the Safavids in Persia, who speak of their origins in a Sufi order, and also different from the Ottomans, who could, of course, claim to be the caliphs of the age. So the Mughals had to find a way of showing themselves to also have a claim to divinity, which didn't encroach on these other approaches of the other rival Muslim empires, but forged a different path for themselves. In that context, it's kind of amusing to see this double page from an album in which Jahangir seems to be facing, perhaps confronting, the portrait of an Ottoman emperor. And here, if you look closely at it, Mary seems to be aiding Jahangir's claim to divine status in this painting as well, but in a way that the Jesuits wouldn't have liked very much, I think, because you can see Mary and the baby Jesus are depicted on this little cup that Jahangir is holding, and the cup was probably meant to be filled with wine. But to return to the real, living, breathing women of the Mughal family, one of the things that has really frustrated scholars about the women of this time is the lack of any true portraits. And this lack seems to be more frustrating in the face of the evidence that we have that if male artists were not allowed into the zinana where the women were living, we know that there were women artists. And the women artists would have been in the zinana. So why did they not leave behind portraits for us? This painting that we're seeing is actually from a fictional text. It's from the Khamsa of Nizami, and it shows an incident within the story in which a princess paints a self-portrait of herself. But you have this drawing, which is in the Bharat Kala Bhavan in Banaras, in which you're probably seeing a kind of a documentary image of a woman artist making a portrait of some female sitter who is posing for her. So the question is, where are these portraits that these women would have made, or these self-portraits that some of these women would have made? Why have none of them come down to us? I don't know where these portraits are, but it's interesting to note that there is evidence of the skill attained by a number of women as artists. And that's because several paintings which have inscriptions ascribing them to an artist with a female name have been preserved for us. It's quite likely that these women whose paintings are preserved were not professional artists from artists' families, but they are probably women from the royal family or from the imperial zenana who make paintings and are able to reach some level of skill, and therefore their paintings are considered worth preserving. For example, here's a page which has 4 different drawings, but the one on the bottom right, which shows an imitation of a European print, has an inscription telling us that it is made by an artist called Ruqayya Banu. Now, this is a page from a Mughal album, which is in Tehran. And one of the frustrating things about this album, which is called the Gulshan album because it's in the Gulshan library of the Gulistan Palace, is that it hasn't been completely published as yet. We haven't got enough people studying it, so we don't know the details about it. But a lot of the paintings that we know are made by women artists are all preserved in the Gulshan album. Here, for example, the painting again on bottom right, which shows Saint Matthew with the lion, copied again from a print, is signed by Nadira Banu. She calls herself the pupil of Aka Raza. He is the artist who is the head of the atelier, which is attached to the Prince Salim. And this painting that we are seeing on the left-hand side is a rather skillful copy of the painting by the famous artist Behzad, which you're seeing on smaller scale on the right-hand side. This is by Sahifa Banu. Not only is it a very skillful copy of Behzad's painting, but Sahifa Banu has even added some sections of her own. So you see the sun in the sky, you see some special clouds swirling around the sun, and you see two additional figures who are watching the construction of this palace that Sahifa Banu has so wonderfully copied from Behzad's masterpiece. We know of another painting by Sahifa Banu. This is a painting which is a portrait of the Shah of Iran. It's probably made after a model which has been lost, so we don't have the original, but you can see again that Sahifa Banu was no mean painter. She was a very, very good, very accomplished artist. But probably the most moving and interesting of the works that we know that were by women artists is this one, which is ascribed to an artist called Nini. It's a copy of a print about the martyrdom of Saint Cecilia. Saint Cecilia lived in the 3rd century. She was an early Christian martyr, and she was the patron saint of musicians. She was ordered to be beheaded, but the executioner had tried to cut her neck 3 times, and he was unsuccessful each time. She survived, grievously wounded, lived on for 3 days, while she slowly bled to death. And you can imagine the allure of this character, a woman who defied authority to follow her faith, boldly faced death, and then the pathos of the story of her passing. What kind of appeal this would have for a woman who is sequestered in her home. If you compare the detail of Saint Cecilia dying in the version that Nini makes with the original print that Nini must have seen, you can see that she softens the axe marks that were on Cecilia's neck, which are pretty prominent in the print, but which are very faintly present in the painting. And what is very touching is the concern of the women who tend to her. And perhaps this is meant to also evoke something of the solidarities of women in the Zenana. Now, this whole business of cloaking women in stereotypes, whether they are anonymous beauties or virtuous virgins or mothers, it places a veil of visibility over them. But powerful and important women weren't really invisible. Scholars of history tell us about the power that was yielded by many women, even apart from Noor Jahan, who was so extraordinary. And as most prominent women lived out their lives behind high walls, in the public space of the Mughal city, their presence could still be marked in some very powerful and prominent ways. For example, one could argue that there is a sense in which the Taj Mahal makes Mumtaz Mahal visible in Agra. Not the image of Mumtaz Mahal, not her face or her body, but the idea of her beauty, the idea of her qualities, the idea of the love she evoked, become imprinted in every citizen's mind. By that token, we could also argue that Humayun's tomb makes Haji Begum, who was the promoter of this project, it makes her visible in public space. And we could say that Noor Jahan's many architectural projects, like Madhuddola's tomb that we're seeing here, Jahangir's tomb, which is in Lahore, the Sarai that she builds in Noor Mahal near Jalandhar, all of them also make her present in the public sphere. And in Shah Jahanabad, the many ambitious architectural commissions of Jahanara, including the Bagh Begum, that was a huge tract of land that was just off Chandni Chowk, or Roshanara's garden, or the mosque made by Fatehpuri Begum, all of these would have been architectural and urban landmarks. They bore the names of the women who had commissioned them. So wealthy and powerful women reshaped the city through buildings and gardens that bore their name. These architectural commissions make the women present without being visible. And these buildings and the paintings that women artists make me also think about the number of women poets whose poems are known to us. We know that Aurangzeb's daughter Zebunissa was an acclaimed poet, and she took Makhfi as a pen name. And the word Makhfi means the concealed one or the hidden one. But I'm told that this pen name was also adopted by multiple royal women poets, including Salima Sultan, one of the wives of Akbar, and by Noor Jahan as well. And literary circles seem to have circulated their poems widely, and the authorship that lies behind the pen name also seems to have been known. Which verses are by Noor Jahan writing as Makhfi? Which ones are by Zebunisa writing as Makhfi? People know about this. So, what is concealed and what is carried forth? I think we have to think of a different category for this kind of presence of women in the public imagination because it is both very visible and very veiled at the same time, as are the women in this famous painting of the first Nowruz celebrations after Jahangir came to the throne. Now, when we look at this famous Darbar scene, it looks as though we are looking at an exclusively masculine gathering. We're seeing an enthroned Jahangir sitting under these canopies. There are all these male courtiers and servants who are surrounding him. But this painting changed irrevocably for me when I realized that the two domed structures in the background are circular tents in which the women are seated, looking onto the scene, probably through the chicks that are hanging on the entrances. And so, if anything, the presence of these powerful women who are unseen but seeing all actually comes to bring even an aura of menace because one has a sense of being scrutinized by faces that one cannot judge for oneself. Finally, I want to take us on a short excursion away from history painting and into the zone of illustration that were made by Mughal artists for fictional and poetic texts. And although the artists were setting the scene of these paintings in their own current milieu, the female characters in these stories had a far more prominent role than women in the historical stories. And so we have already seen characters like this bold and fearless lady from the Hamza Nama. You would never encounter a character like this in the depiction of a historical painting in Jahangir's time, even though we know that Noor Jahan was no less brave and no less scheming than Khosh Khirram was. But the depiction of women within fictional stories gives the artist freer rein to show women doing a different range of things and to be able to show her with greater sympathy and insight. There is the fabulous Ramayana that is made for Akbar, which sadly generations of scholars haven't seen because it's locked up in a vault in Jaipur because there is a kind of a court case going on between members of the royal family, because of which the painting of this manuscript remain unseen for about 30 years now. In the Ramayana, we can see from the few paintings that are available to us that Sita is shown very prominently and very empathetically by the artist. Here is Sita at the moment of abduction by Ravan, where he is so cruelly grabbing her by the hair and pulling her off. Here is the Agni Pariksha, in which Sita steps into the flames, and you can see that the artist's sympathies again are with this woman who has to perform this horrific act to defend all the charges against her. In general, women in these fictional texts and the accompanying illustrations have much more agency than the women who are depicted in the illustrations of historical paintings. Like this virtuous woman who is being pursued by a king. And she asks him, "What can I have done to you that you are so obsessed with me? I don't want your attentions. I veil myself so discreetly every time I go out. How have I deserved this attention?" And he says, "Well, you veiled yourself well, but I was captivated by your eyes." And in response, when the woman hears that, she says, "All right, if my eyes have captivated you, you can have my eyes." And she gouges out her eyes and has them sent to the man on a platter. On the left-hand side, we see the startled king receiving this unwanted gift. On the right-hand side, there is the detail of this perhaps foolishly brave or foolishly virtuous woman fainting with pain while the concerned maidservants tend to her and try to stanch the flow of blood that is coming out of her eyes. In the story of Shireen and Khusro, the artist can choose to show Shireen again as this woman who is owning her love for Khusro to the point where he can show her at the moment where, after he has died, she goes to mourn at his grave and chooses to kill herself instead. And so you have this sudden movement that she makes of stabbing herself in her belly and the blood gushing out and her collapsing on his grave. But not before the same Shireen freely expresses her grief at the death of the blameless Farhad, who had loved her from afar, but who was tricked by Khusro to his death. So in all of these paintings, the woman is out there in space, doing things, loving people, owning her emotions, defending herself. This gives her agency of a kind in these fictional paintings, which it's not possible for the artist to give to the decorous paintings of women in scenes from the court. Let me leave you today now with an illustration from the Bustan of Sadi, from a chapter that meditates on the insignificance of bodies and beauty and love and attachment in the face of the ineluctability of death. This illustration may or may not relate to the verse that I found of a man who goes to the grave of the woman he had loved and whom he had to bury, and for whom he had specially got a silken shroud. And when he's confronted by the decay of her body and the rotting of the shroud, he realizes that there is a cycle of life in which he snatched away the silk from the silkworms, but now the maggots of the grave are snatching away the shroud from his beloved. At this moment where we see this man looking at his decaying loved one, we are in the midst of a pandemic that makes our grip on life look so uncertain. I thought this is a good place as any for us to end this presentation. Thank you for your attention. I'll try and see if I can stop sharing the screen so that I can move to the camera and we can have a little discussion.